Then I'm going to turn off my mic and we'll hit start webinar, and then we'll be able to see the people coming in. So I'm going to hit start webinar right now.
Hello, everyone. We're just watching as people join our event. We'll give it a minute or so here. Getting our presentation already. Okay. Well, welcome to this University of Missouri St. Louis speaker series from UMSL Global tonight. My name is Evie Hemphill, and I'm a producer for the flagship talk show at St. Louis Public Radio, St. Louis on the Air. It always makes me really happy to know that our public radio station is also, in fact, a part of UMSL. We're a public service of this great university, as well as part of the NPR network. And I'm so glad to be part of this speaker series focused on gaining a better understanding of the history and culture and current situation of Afghanistan, as well as how to support Afghan people arriving in our communities. Tonight marks the first of several presentations that are all part of this year's Dr. Edwin Fedder Lecture on Foreign and International Affairs. Dr. Fetter was the founder of UMSL's international office about 50 years ago, which is now called UMSL Global. The lecture series captures one of his key ideas that continues to be true and valid. Global understanding requires regular interaction and a good information about the world. In that spirit, our speaker tonight is Tom Gouttierre. Tom is the Director Emeritus of the Center for Afghanistan Studies at the University of Nebraska Omaha. He is someone who has spent many years both living in Kabul and providing important resources from afar, from the basketball court to diplomatic affairs and so much more. Tom first set foot in Afghanistan in 1965 as a Peace Corps volunteer. He quickly grew to love the country and its people, and before long would be coaching young Afghan men and women in a sport he loved. But Tom's connections to Afghanistan didn't end with his Peace Corps service. He would go on to become friends with former President Hamid Karzai. US ambassadors often sought Tom's counsel in recent decades. And he's proved a resource to Afghan students and teachers, and so many others over the course of his career. I'm so pleased to welcome Tom Gouttierre tonight. As a reminder, we plan to save some time for audience questions via the Q&A tool following Tom's presentation. So feel free to send those along in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to lots of them afterwards. And now, Tom, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Evie, and it's a great delight for me to be with you. We're covering a topic which was heavy in the news in July and August, and which comes up now and again in the news, but it's kind of fading, and it has been a tragic several months for Afghans, Afghanistan, and for the United States. And most of the headlines we'll be seeing in the future relating to Afghanistan will be probably even more tragic. We're facing a winter in which a country without much humanitarian aid is close to starving, in which a country has a new leadership which has no experience in the management of a nation, of social works, of public works, of human services. And we are also facing a situation where security in that region, security for the United States, its NATO allies, and others in the region may be adversely affected by a lack of stabilized government in Afghanistan. What I want to do tonight is to take a look at three different periods. One, I want to take a look at Afghanistan's early cultural period and remind people of the rich linguistic and cultural heritage that the people of Afghanistan share, and that we share with them as fellow Indo-Europeans, as fellow Indo-Aryans. And after I've done that, I'm going to take some travels with you during Afghanistan's golden age, a period that essentially covered the 50s, 60s, and early 70s. I'm doing this because I think most people have in their minds today images from the Kabul airport or other images from years of war. Afghans have gone through more than 40 years of continuous warfare and violence. And we didn't have much of a chance really to get to see the kinds of lives that Afghans were enjoying during the last 20 years. Very much different from what most people thought might be the situation, because most of us saw Afghanistan on TV as a place where violence and war and destitution were more visible than the lives of Afghans living in population centers. And at the very end, I'll cover a bit of recent history and politics, examining who are these Taliban really? Are they the Taliban? How many Taliban are there? Where do they come from? Where do they get their money? Where do they seek refuge? And then I'll close that off and with my favorite poem from Persian, and then we'll have questions and answers. So let's get going with, first of all, Afghanistan on the spice and silk roads. I like to say that this was the period in early human history, early human civilization in Asia, moving to the west, in which we had this great Silk Road, spice road connecting with it, that for 5,000 years was the primary commercial, linguistic, cultural highway for humankind. And along that ancient silk and spice road, the internet of its day was the Persian language. So next, please. So you'll see in this map, Afghanistan right in the center of Asia. And now picture, if you would, that spice road would have started all the way over in China to the right in that big yellow area and would travel all the way to the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, and the Red Sea. And it was a very, very active road, and one that most people feel probably grew up with population centers around places with water. And while that is true, and while that was important, generally the primary draw to the population aggregations throughout the countries that constituted what is today most of Asia was the presence of salt. This was the premier resource that most people saw. Next. So this is a map I did a number of years ago for National Geo, and it shows the arrows of how this reached. And if you take a look, you can see from the outlines that the spread of the silk and spice roads coming up from India, the Silk Road coming off from China, moving all the way to the west to Egypt and to Greece. And eventually, of course, Alexander and others would move from the west, but they were all after the same objective: controlling the major artery of humankind of that time, the Silk Spice Roads. That was why Alexander went east, not only just to get at the Persians who had conquered or had tried to conquer Greece earlier. People went after things. They went after people, other resources, money, and they did this by traveling those Silk and Spice Roads. Next. This is a kind of another look at those Silk and Spice Roads from another map, and you can see how intricate that whole thing was, and that the use of even routes from the seas that went up and got goods going back and forth across the landmass of Asia. Next. And again, another look at these roads in the more eastern part of the Silk Road itself. And you can see where parts of Afghanistan there towards the left near Samarkand and Bukhara from the Central Asian countries of today. These all had major locations for the movement of these goods. Next. So this is the complete Silk Road map. It's a biggie, and it helps us to understand. Remember, this was going on for thousands and thousands of years. Yes, next. And this is how they went. They still travel the Gobi Desert in this very same way. Next. So before you is probably the most famous image of a human face anywhere in the world today. This is King Tut's sarcophagus. This is his face. We see usually the first thing is the gold, but if you look laid in among that gold is lapis lazuli. Lapis lazuli could only get to Egypt from Afghanistan. That's where it was. And that helps to kind of point out again the central nature of Afghanistan. In the center of Silk and Spice Roads, with its resources, the turquoise above his forehead coming from Iran, and gold from other places. But this is what the Egyptians were after. The Chinese wanted the cotton from the Mediterranean area, as did the people in the Persian-speaking areas wanted silk. So things were moving, not only people, but many, many goods, spices, particularly, again, salt and sugar and peppers. Next. So this was the crossroads of Asia, Afghanistan. The Persian and the Greeks came here. Zoroaster, famous philosopher for Zoroastrian religion, the religion that the Persians adopted. Next. This is Zoroaster. Next. So the leaders of the Persian Empire, Cyrus, Darius, Xerxes, were all believers, and they had a very egalitarian approach, at least for that era, in terms of their management of people. They set up governing areas. They did not subject people to their religion. People were free to practice their religion. Those of you who are familiar with the Bible know that Cyrus appeared in the Bible. He let the Jews go free, the Israelites go free from their Babylonian captivity back to their Holy Land and elsewhere. Next. So next, it's Cyrus. Next. Cyrus didn't want to go there, but anyhow, take a look. This is Persepolis, and the next picture we're going to see right after this, right now, is also in Persepolis, and I want you to take very close regard on this. Okay, next, please. And you'll see here that the people in these friezes are holding their hands, putting hands on their shoulder. Every other nation from this area, when you see friezes, you've got people under the ruler's foot, under the ruler's yoke. And this is very, very much different from that from that in the Persian Empire. I'm not saying it was an all free place, but it was more egalitarian than most others. Next, please. Then Alexander comes through, and again, he was after the major commerce and culture and soldiers and populations that were along the Silk and Spice Roads. He first started out in Egypt, came up through what we call today as the Near East, Syria, Iraq, into Iran, across Afghanistan into Central Asia, back on down into Afghanistan, into what is today Pakistan, the Indus River, then on over by the Arabian Sea, up Persian Gulf to get to Baghdad, to Babylon, where he eventually died, all by the time he was 33 years old. Amazing person. Next. This is Alexander next. Buddhism came into Afghanistan a few years before the period of the beginning of Christianity. And next, please. And they had major Buddhist monasteries, one in Bamyan in Afghanistan. And in the center of that picture is the space of where one of the largest at the time carved statues in the world. These are the statues which the Taliban blew up in the valley of Bamyan, which was a premier depot on the Silk and Spice routes. Next. That's that Buddha from back in the periods 2 to 600 AD, or the Christian era, Common Era. Next. This is what the Taliban did to it, all right? So little caves and stuff along there are from the facing of that mountain massif. And back in there, there were about 5 kilometers of caves and dormitories and refractories and stuff of this nature. Next. So again, this is Afghanistan in the center of all of that, and a very, very important part, at least logistically. It's something I'm sure not many of us were thinking about as we kept seeing it in the news. Next. So it's important also to think back on what are the peoples that come from here. And you'll see the Iranian or Indo-Aryan, the origins of the Caucasian races. And this is how people were moving back and forth throughout this time prior to, the zero common era and stuff, and after. And so there was a lot of intermingling, and eventually these folks, Hitler had invited the Afghans to the 1936 Olympics because he believed they were the original Aryans. And so they didn't have much of a team. They marched in the parades, etc. But in any case, that was at least genealogically true. The Afghans are Indo-Aryan, Indo-European people, as are Northern Indians and the Iranians. So they're not Semitic, they're not Arab. Most people think they are because they're Muslim, that they also must be Semitic or must be Arabs. Next. We're just going to see a number of maps here now which show how all these migrations were going back into India, out of India. Next, please. And we wound up with this language, Persian, as the primary language for communication and commerce along these routes. And many of the languages from that area today still speak, some of it Iran Farsi, and Afghanistan Dari, and Tajikistan Tajiki, as well as in Uzbekistan, in South Asia Parsi, and there's Dagestani in the Caucasus, and Persian in Western China as well. Next, please. So the origins of these languages, next. You'll see here the family of the Indo-European languages. And if you take a look at the top line, you see the Celtic, Germanic, which is English, the Italic, which is the Hispanic or Latin languages, Slavonic, and et cetera, et cetera. To the far right, you see the Indo-Iranian, which we have in the center of that Indo-Aryan or Indian, which is based on Sanskrit. And there are a number of other languages, Bengali, Hindi, et cetera, which are a part of this Indo-European language family. And in the Iranian, you have Persian, Kurdish, Baluchi, Pashto, and others. And so, again, this is to remind people what are the connections really the Afghans had that most people really weren't aware of to our joint common history. Next. So I'm going to ask you now, Bob, just to move forward on this because I could go on and on and on about this. So, but the language adopted during the time of Mamun, the use of Arabic as its written script, but continued to be an Indo-European language. And next, please. So we come here and this is where we're going to leave the globalization and Persian as the ancient internet. But I wanted all of you who are watching to have an understanding of the richness that Afghans feel, Iranians feel, Persian speakers in Central Asia and Western China feel, relating to their language, their culture, how they trace it back thousands and thousands of years, connected from east to west, north to south, and they feel great pride. The language itself, Persian, is considered to be, if not the richest, certainly among the richest, but many say it is the richest in terms of poetic expression among the Indo-European languages from their golden linguistic period. So many of you have heard of Sufi poetry, which comes from Persian language. And we'll see one or two of those later on in the presentation. Next, I think from here, Bob, let us go now to the golden age of Afghanistan. Evie's cat.
Yes, that's Dash. Sorry about my picture.
What I'm doing now is doing a bridge from this ancient period to go to Afghanistan's golden age. And if you could just move up, Bob, to the picture of the two kings, which is about 3 or 4 slides in. And this is it. So in 1933, the man on the right succeeded the man on the left, his father. His father had been assassinated. So Zahir Shah on the right was king of Afghanistan for 40 years, 1933 to 1973, when one of his cousins overthrew him because he was jealous. He died many years later. He came back to Afghanistan in 2003, 30 years after he left it. He was welcomed back into his country by the new Republican government of Afghanistan led by Hamid Karzai. During this period, and this is what I want you to notice now. So next picture, please. This young man, he was then 19 years old. He had been educated in France and came from the major primary Afghan Durrani tribes, which you see on the left-hand side. He's of the Mohammedzai branch of that Durrani tribe. Hamid Karzai from those same major Durrani Pashtuns was from the Sadozai on the right. I'm not going to go deeply into all this, but this is the main family that ruled Afghanistan and still has many leaders in Afghanistan, but it ruled Afghanistan until the coup in 1978. Next, please. The king was helped by his uncles after his father was assassinated. So there's the king in the middle of the upper picture, and his uncles. Was a very close family, well knit, and they had a very good, strong governmental structure. Next. So again, I like to keep throwing this map out here because I'd like you to see where Afghanistan is in relationship to the other countries around it, Pakistan, Iran, the stands to the north, China. See that Afghanistan reaches in and touches and shares a border with China. When we left the Bagram Air Base, we lost a very, very important listening post to what was going on in Western China. Next, please. This is Afghanistan's essential provincial divisional structure. So Afghanistan just wasn't a wild and woolly place. It had very structured civil servant infrastructure, people who reported back to Kabul as governors in each of these provinces that you see here. Next. Afghanistan's ethnic groups, you can see, again, the languages, Indo-European predominantly, except in the very, very northern part, there were Turkic languages, Uzbeki and Turkmeni and Kyrgyz, but throughout most of the central part of Afghanistan, Persian speakers, and in the south, Pashtun speakers. The largest, most populous speaking group in Afghanistan combination are Persian speakers. That's because everybody in Afghanistan just about speaks Persian, even if you're not originally a Persian speaker, but not everybody speaks Pashto. And even in the royal family, the king of Afghanistan, though he was a Pashtun, because he had been urbanized, was primarily a Persian speaker. Next. This is Kabul. This is the way the city was laid out when I went there in 1965 as a Peace Corps volunteer. And the interesting thing about this map is that that grid is essentially the same grid in Afghanistan today. There's been, however, a tremendous population increase that is spread out beyond this map, but this is still the central part of Afghanistan. When I first went there as a Peace Corps volunteer, there were about 260,000 people living in Kabul. Today, there are about 6 million. Major difference. We'll talk about that and how that impact has for the future in the next, farther down the presentation. Next. I want to show you just some pictures here. This is the city. First of all, that was the major Kabul River that we just passed through. And this is the Royal Palace of Afghanistan. I could bike into that place. I did because the sons of the king were my students. So I got to visit. They invited me over for tea. I just biked into the Royal Palace. You couldn't get anywhere near this now palace, the presidential palace of Afghanistan, because of the security issues. Next. This is traffic in Afghanistan and Kabul in the 1960s. You have a lot of Russian, but also some Western automobiles as well. This is the tomb of one of the past kings of Afghanistan, King Amir Abdurrahman Khan. So I want you to see that way back in the 50s and 60s and even before, Afghanistan was a city with paved roads, even a rail system in the cities. And so next, please. And then I have a lot of black and white pictures. That's because this is back in 1965. Everybody told me don't take color pictures because they wouldn't last. So I took a lot of black and whites as well. These are Afghan mothers in the 1960s with their kids in the playgrounds. You notice the length of their skirts. You notice they're not wearing those all-encompassing chauderies, which people in the West call burqas. Next. Here they are going to work on the bus. They sit in the front, men in the back. These people are working in the government or they're teachers, and women wear veils. Later on in the late 60s and early 70s, women weren't even wearing veils. So this was in the kind of the early mid 60s that this picture was taken. Next. The bazaars were full. This is oranges, tomatoes, and there are all kinds of these like this. The Russians used to love to be assigned to Afghanistan because they could go down and find plentiful food in the bazaars of Afghanistan, unlike the way they lived in Moscow or St. Petersburg or wherever, or Leningrad. But anyhow, it was a lot of fun to go to the bazaar and to bargain and to buy one's meals for the day. That was a part of life, good life in Kabul. Go ahead, next. Now this is long before most cities in the United States, moving into the modern era. Here they had a bus system running on an electric power. And so you can see the houses up on the hills behind this, but this is one of the major bus stations in Kabul. Next. This, by the way, is the car of the German ambassador, I believe, and you'll notice it's a Cadillac. This again is along the Kabul River in Kabul. Next. This is a power station. There were very many of them in Afghanistan, hydroelectric. Afghanistan has lots of water melting out of the Hindu Kush Mountains, and so they were able to power Kabul and other cities, particularly in the east and north, through this hydroelectric power. They later on, and we're going to get to this, started to do the same in the south with the U.S. help. And this was also built with German and American help, this particular dam. Next. So there was industry in Afghanistan. They produced great quality cotton and they wove it, and so people were working. And so this, again, these are people who lived in a population center, went home at night like we do, and got up in the morning and went to work. Next. Same here, people working at a factory nearby. Next. And here are some Afghan women at the local record store buying Beatles records in the 1960s, okay? Okay, next, please. I knew those two young women. They were teachers. So now I'm going to just show you some pictures. This is the king in the upper left corner with President Eisenhower, who came to visit Afghanistan in the 1950s. And then the king later came to visit President Kennedy in 1963. And so here you see pictures of the king's visit and visits with our president. So Eisenhower came to Afghanistan. King Zahir Shah, now quite a bit older than that 19-year-old in 1963 in Washington, D.C. with John Kennedy. Next. And so King Zahir Shah, 1962, with Queen Humaira in the U.S. with President Kennedy and Mrs. Shriver, because Jackie, I think, was in India at this time, so she wasn't able to be there. So Mrs. Shriver. Eunice Shriver was the hostess for the Kennedys during this visit. Next. So Afghanistan was very actively involved in the non-aligned nations. You'll see here he's with Tito, and see down in the lower left here, he's the king is meeting with Spiro Agnew, who came to visit. And Ambassador Newman is there. And so we had an active diplomatic relationship with Afghans. And so again, this is to belie the image that I think that most people have of just Afghanistan being the place where in the Cold War, the Soviets invaded, and then we had the terrorists, and then we had the Taliban, and now we have what we have. Next. Again, the prime minister meeting with that's the Daoud at the top. He's the cousin who overthrew the king in 1973 because he wanted to be the leader, which was a real mistake. Meeting with Eisenhower. That same guy meeting with Khrushchev and Zhou Enlai. Next. So in 1944, we came together and started our whole diplomatic relationship with Afghanistan. Next. That would lead eventually to the presence of Americans on major development programs in Afghanistan and the Peace Corps. So start with the Peace Corps. Next. Next. That's me. My assistant was playing games with me and threw this baby picture. So that's about 81 years old in any case. Next. So on the upper hand left there, a friend of mine and my wife, Mary Lou, when we were newly arrived Peace Corps volunteers in Afghanistan, 1965. On the right, a couple of Peace Corps volunteers at what is today the Hamid Karzai Airport. And it had been newly constructed by the Russians. They were just getting ready to leave. This was in December of 65. Their Peace Corps term was coming to an end. There I am with that friend in the center. That's me without a goatee and when my hair was still a darker color in 1965. But this was the place in which we lived, a kind of an adobe house in Afghanistan as Peace Corps volunteers. Next. These are Peace Corps volunteers at the Peace Corps office going through training and improving our ability to teach English as a second language. So there were many of us. There were about 250 in Afghanistan at any one given time. Most of them were teaching English as a second language. Afghans would demonstrate in front of the Ministry of Education. They wanted American Peace Corps volunteer teachers. And other Peace Corps volunteers were working in community development programs, vaccination programs, and a variety of other activities. But the biggest area was English as a second language. Next. Just to show you, we had another life. This is me. I'm giving away a Peace Corps volunteer to a fellow Peace Corps volunteer who got married. They got married, they fell in love. And while they were Peace Corps volunteers, we had a bunch of Afghans at the wedding at the Catholic church on the Italian embassy's grounds in Kabul. So this young woman, Sheila O'Farrell, married a fellow Peace Corps volunteer. I was the father of the bride because the father couldn't come those 10,000 miles from away for this wedding. But anyhow, look at, so she got her wedding gown made in Afghanistan. My suit was made there, as well in Afghanistan by great tailors. Okay, next. This is a little self-promotional. That's me on the right. That's a wedding cake in the center. I baked it and decorated. I was a master pastry chef before I went into the Peace Corps. But this is another couple of Peace Corps volunteers who are getting married next at their reception. Peace Corps volunteers at a local orphanage. We were entertaining. So we were doing what was called a hootenanny back in those days in the 1960s. And we're dancing and singing. Next. And again, next. So there's my wife and me on the left doing all this. But this is what we had, a very active life, a lot of fun. I coached basketball. This is the Peace Corps team itself. This is the stadium, which has been so famous and infamous. This is a stadium which today people are, during the time of the Taliban, were killed or executed for adultery or whatever. And but this is where we played basketball. This is where I also coached the Afghan national basketball team in games with others outdoors. Next. That's me in the center with the basketball. So that's quite a while ago. Same here next. So you see the stadium. That's Ghazi Stadium in Kabul. Next. This is an article about my coaching of the basketball team in Sports Illustrated. This is me and my son, who was born to my wife and myself in Afghanistan when I was head of the Fulbright Foundation there. Yes, they used to wear striped pants like that back in the 1970s. And we were at the embassy grounds. This is my son, Adam, and he lives now in Omaha, Nebraska. Next, please. Now, USAID. So let's move along quickly here, Bob. So I want to just show some pictures. We did a lot of major development projects in Afghanistan. This is just a list of the number of Afghans who studied in the United States alone. So we had a lot of people in the Afghan brain structure, infrastructure, who were trained in agriculture, population studies, statistical information, communications, agriculture, as I mentioned, pilots, etc. Next, studying in the United States. They also studied in Germany and France and Italy, Russia, etc. Now we're looking at Kandahar province. Next. We built, these are the kind of like the counties of Kandahar province. Again, give you a sense that in Afghanistan, there is a structural governmental arrangement. Next. And this is the tribal makeup of that area. So these are all essentially Pashtuns of different kind of tribes. Next. This is Dala Dam near Kandahar. It made that whole province very, very productive agriculturally. It had not been for hundreds of years, but it now was through American help. Next, please. Made it very, very verdant. They were growing all kinds of fruits and vegetables and nuts. Afghanistan was a net exporter of pomegranates, melons, apricots, almonds, walnuts, etc., to South Asia and the Persian Gulf. Next. Next, just examples of that. This is the airport in Kandahar. The United States built that airport because the Russians built the one in Kabul. This is the airport eventually that the Al-Qaeda took over. And then prior to that, the Russians did. They used it for bases when they tried to occupy Afghanistan. It still stands. It's still a very uniquely constructed building, very strong, very sturdy. It faces to the north, so it doesn't have problems with too much heat in Kandahar because of the structures. It got an award for its structural makeup, but that done by USAID. Next. Okay, now we're going to Helmand. So what happened is that essentially in Afghanistan, there was a ring road. People could drive. We used to take off on the weekends and drive from Kabul down to, say, the Helmand, this area here, for vacations and stuff. People could get up and go and travel around. It was, security was remarkable. It was safer there than back home. And my wife, I often say it was, and I have to say this to because she would appreciate the fact that I mention that she's still the same weight that she was when we were Peace Corps volunteers, about 110 pounds on 5 feet. And she could hop on her bicycle, go in the darkest bazaars of Kabul without any concern about her security, shopping and meeting friends and stuff. Next. So this is Helmand province. And it was a major area for fighting during the war against the Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Next. But it also became the breadbasket of Afghanistan. Next. And the reason that it did is because we built the largest earthen dam, that was that one, in that area, the Kajakai Dam, which helped to provide power to the southern part of Afghanistan and irrigate that whole area. Next. Well, let's just move along. These are just friends of mine in Afghanistan, myself during the visit. So this just shows, how things are going on in these areas through USAID programs. Next. Next. These are just maps, and I want to now move us on to the last part of our presentation. So if you'll move forward, Bob, to still next. That's again that Kajakai Dam. Okay, and I think the next map show me. Well, I hate to go through the monarchy ended in 1973 when Daoud there overthrew his cousin, the king, his brother-in-law as well. He was overthrown himself next by a group of people who had been working with the Soviets. Next. And we got to move this on since I don't want to run out of time here. So move that on that way when we get to this. Next, there was a coup in 1978, which was vetted by the Soviet Union, and that didn't go the way they wanted, and so they eventually invaded and occupied all that period during which the communists were in control, 1978 to 1992. We're led by one of these 4 people whose picture will come up on the next screen. Well, not yet, but that's the Sour Revolution. The Soviets invaded. So up on the upper left hand, Nur Mohammed Taraki was a poetry club member, friend of mine, but he was a communist. He didn't like the West. Babrak Karmal, upper right. He became president after Taraki and Amin, lower left, very most charismatic Afghan. He came to the United States on Fulbright and USAID funds, studied at Columbia University and the University of Wisconsin. And Najibullah down on the lower left, he was the last communist ruler of Afghanistan. He was also my student in the 12th grade when I was a Peace Corps volunteer. As was, by the way, Ashraf Ghani, the very last president of Afghanistan, who just left in August. And Salmai Khalilzad, the ambassador, he was on my basketball team. So these are individuals I knew well. Next, please. Now we came to that period that we knew after 9/11. I told you the king in the upper left-hand corner came back, Hamid Karzai, then the ruler in Afghanistan, upper right and upper left. He welcomed him back. And King Zahir Shah came back to be the godfather of Afghanistan until he died in about 2007. He's a very close friend of mine, the king, and so was Hamid Karzai. I knew his father well. When his father was a member of parliament during the time of the king. And Hamid Karzai, after meeting with Obama, he fell out with us because he was very much upset with the fact that the United States bombing all parts of Afghanistan after the terrorists, when he kept saying that the terrorists actually were in Pakistan, along the western border of Pakistan with Afghanistan's eastern border, and going after the wrong people, and a lot of innocent Afghans were being killed. So he was distressed by that. Next, please. This is him and me. I was his guest at the presidential palace. Next, please. Okay, back to that map, and then to my end about the Taliban. So Bob, if you'll move forward. And want to get to the map that shows the Afghan-Pakistan border, which is, I think, two more. One more. So if you take a look at that heavy black line, that's the Pakistani-Afghanistan border, all right? If you see the light green area, this is the area during the Soviet period in which many of the Afghan refugees went. And they were there, we helped them, so did many others. There were about 5 million of them at least. Some say actually as many as 7.5 million were in that part of Afghanistan. Pakistan. And then when the Soviets left, they all fled, the Afghans, when the Soviets invaded. When the Soviets left, many of them remained behind. They weren't quite ready to go back. But those who did go back would go back to the population centers of Afghanistan. They didn't go back to the rural areas from which they may have come. When my wife and I arrived in Afghanistan, maybe about 25% lived in population centers, 75 in rural areas. That percentage is essentially flipped. And there are millions and millions of people living in Kabul, Kandahar, Mazar-i-Sharif, Herat, Jalalabad. And people, when they went back to Afghanistan after their period in this of the refugee status during the Soviet occupation, they wanted to have the same kind of health and education benefits that they were getting in those refugee camps, as much as they may have not preferred to be there, but they couldn't get those in the rural areas of Afghanistan. So Afghanistan changed. It was transformed by this whole experience. And then when the Taliban came, after the Soviets left, we dumped the Afghans, unfortunately, in 1989. It didn't do much with them at all. It didn't help them really try and get back the way we should have. There was a major vacuum, and a lot of the elements, the nefarious, violent, jihadist kind of elements that had risen in the Middle East, primarily over the competition between Shia Sunni Islam and drug groups, etc. So they were became kind of dominant in this area, the light green area in Pakistan. And the Saudis had constructed some 10,000 plus madrasas in those areas, and the extremist elements of Wahhabi, Jihadi Islam were dominant there. And those madrasas turned into training camps, which produced in Pakistan, with money that was channeled by the Pakistani First Ministry of Interior, then the Ministry of Defense's ISI, the Inter Services Intelligence, and they were trained, funded, and were able to have refuge in that area, all managed by the Pakistani government with monies from the Persian Gulf, with monies that helped to fund also Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. So the Taliban of today are not individuals who have lived in Afghanistan in any of the population centers. They spent most of their time in which they weren't fighting in a guerrilla band inside that light green area in Pakistan, where it was their sanctuary, where they were getting money, where they were getting additional training, weaponry, and then they would go back in and fight. So in many ways, the Taliban are, though many of them are originally Afghan, are not Afghans who have lived in Afghanistan. What major problem that we have in Afghanistan right now for Afghans, other than the inability of the Taliban to understand the need to address the civil and human rights of the Afghans, is that the Taliban aren't trained to do anything. None of them has ever worked as a manager, as an administrator of any kind. Now they're in control. And they don't know how to manage a city of 6 million, which has been very modernized. skyscrapers, a place where in the past young women would go to the beauty parlors, even bowl. We're on TV shows. There was a, voice competition and dance competition things on Afghan TV as well. They were living in, kind of a modernized experience that was a product of the 20 years of the development that we helped the Afghans have. And now the Taliban don't know how to manage that. It's a real problem for them. We're coming into the winter time. The country is short on money, it's short on food, and short on managerial assets. And it's going to create, I'm sure, a humanitarian crisis. It's also a tragedy for the Afghans, our departure. And it's a tragedy for us as well, because we made promises. I was in the room with President Bush when he made promises to President Karzai about what we were going to do to help Afghans develop, to get educated, to have medicine, to have their infrastructure rebuilt. And so we're not seen as a nation which has kept to that promise. And it's a tragedy for Americans who had served there because they believe very much in their mission. But I believe, unfortunately, that the presidencies of Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden really never understood the situation, never had a strategy, never really took on the issue of the Pakistanis arming, training, and giving refuge to the Taliban. So when we pulled out, the Taliban still have their support coming in from the same monies that still fund Al-Qaeda, jihadi elements, and the Taliban themselves. So I haven't gotten into a lot of the politics. I'd be most pleased to do that in the question and answer period. So I'm going to stop right there with one more thing, and that is one more slide, if you could, Bob. I think 2 or 3 more slides. I want to get to a poem. So next, I'll say which one. Keep going. Okay, it's the next one. So this next one more. This is my favorite poem in any language, and it's back back to that poem, please, Bob. Okay, I'm going to read it, but I'm going to recite it actually, and it goes like this. It's in Persian. I just want you to hear Persian. Then I'll do the translation. I think you should see the fact that Afghans are rich in their love of poetry, love of culture. It goes like this. It's called Rose and Clay. Gili khushbui dar hamam rozi rasid as dusty mabubi badusty. Do guftum ke mushki abari ki as bui dilawizi tu must. Gufta man gili nachis bunu alaykan budeti bogul nachistan. Mali ham nashin darmano serkad warganaman amon falkem ki asta. One day at Bath, a piece of perfumed clay was passed to me from the hand of a friend. I asked the clay, "Are you musk or ambergris? Because your delightful scent intoxicates me." It answered, "I am but a worthless piece of clay that has sat for a period with a rose. Perfection of that companion left its traces on me. Remains that same piece of earth that I was." This poem is the favorite poem of all Afghans to express their appreciation for friendship, for love. I have never met a people who are more hostile than the Afghan people are. That's the reason I fell in love with that country. It's the reason why I retain my strong feelings for them. They were so hospitable to me, so warm, and I think this poem does it so well. So we can remove the the slides, Bob, and we can go to the screen. Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you, Tom. And we will turn to our questions and answers now. And we've got a couple already in our Q&A tool here. And now quite a few. So I'd like to start with one from Trey. Trey asks, what role has India played in Afghanistan's development over the past 50 years?
This is a question that has a lot of strategic importance. And Pakistan's primary foreign policy objective is to ensure that its western border, Afghanistan, is not going to be hostile because of its paranoia of India. Remember, Pakistan's lost 3 wars to India. They both have atomic weapons. Pakistan lost half its country to India, and that country became independent of Bangladesh. Had been East and West Pakistan. So Pakistanis would rather see Afghanistan in chaos than friendly with India. And during the period of the monarchy and that period thereafter, before the Soviet invasion, Afghans were closer to the Indians than they were to the Pakistanis because there were border issues. And so it's that old dictum, the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thing. So the Indians were very active, building certain things in Afghanistan, a hospital, very important hospital in Afghanistan, but other projects as well. And there was a lot of trade between Afghanistan and India. I mentioned those melons and fruits, and nuts, etc. A lot of that export from Afghanistan went into India and Pakistan as well. But there were issues there because most of the stuff that went into India had to go through Pakistan, through the Khyber Pass, etc. But so there's a real connection. And it'll be very interesting now to see how that plays out during this Taliban period.
Okay, thank you. A couple more. Tom, what from Michaela, what do you think the future of Afghanistan with the Taliban in charge will look like?
Well, I don't think it's going to look good. Some people thought that maybe with the Taliban in control, the fighting no longer going on between the Taliban and the Afghan government, that maybe there would be greater peace. But we still see that there are still suicide bombings, blowing up mosques, etc. And notice that most of the mosques, and always when you're taking a look at the news, notice that the mosques that are being attacked are Shia mosques, because all the Taliban are Sunni. All their money is coming from the Persian Gulf, and the same monies that fund the jihadi elements like ISIS and Al Qaeda, not Shia. Sunni extremists like Al Qaeda and ISIS see Shia Muslims, majority of whom are in Iran and Iraq, but also numbers in Afghanistan. They see them as blasphemers and the primary enemy. So this is a continuing problem in Afghanistan. Plus, as I mentioned a little earlier, it's the winter coming, the population centers. There's not going to be enough food. It's not maybe going to be the right kind of energy. There's not going to be people who are going to be managing this stuff unless the Taliban can persuade very able civil servants of Afghanistan's major population centers to continue to work. But if they work, how do they get paid? It's the country's bankrupt, and it's lost most of its income, and so it at least immediately it doesn't look good. I hope somehow or other through the UN or some other sources we're going to have means to get humanitarian aid for Afghans, particularly in the population center.
Tom, kind of I think a quick follow-up to something you touched on. Edward asked, does ISIS have a Pakistan connection and funding as well?
Well, that same area that I showed on the map where the Taliban were receiving their training, etc., is the area where all the jihadi groups are able to congregate and have congregated in the madrasas and training areas in that region. So this is how do people get into Afghanistan to join, with or fight against the Taliban, they come through Pakistan. And remember, Afghanistan's a landlocked country, so they have to get in. ISIS is not going to fly into Kabul or Kandahar. They have to get in overland, and the only way they can do that is through Pakistan. So Pakistan still is very critical. We never, as a country, during these last 20 years, really had a strategy that recognized that our own people were being killed because of the actions of our ally, Pakistan, in supporting the Taliban, training the Taliban, giving them sanctuary, supporting groups, or if not supporting them, at least letting them come in and then use that part of their country as a staging area to going into Afghanistan, which all makes Afghanistan chaotic, which Pakistanis probably don't really care about.
Okay, tons of great questions here. Going to try to get to as many as we can. Manusha asks, what will the regional and global ripple effects be after the past decades of foreign intervention in Afghanistan, as well as the past couple months? That's Manusha.
Well, when some of the questions have already kind of touched on the periphery of that point, and that is this: what's going to happen in the relationship between Pakistan and India? What about Iran and Pakistan, who have issues? Iranians are concerned about Shia in Pakistan and the 20% of the population of Afghanistan, which are Shia, and who are the ones whose mosques and population centers are being attacked by ISIS-K. And ISIS-K, we've got to remember, is linked with one of the primary Taliban elements, the Haqqani group. And so, you can't separate them and just say ISIS-K and the Taliban are opposed to each other. Some in the Taliban are friends with the ISIS-K, ISIS Khorasan. Huh? So there's no the Taliban. And that's, something I should have said earlier. There is no the Taliban. There is a movement with many, many different groups all around the country, all Pashtun. During the period in the 90s when they were in control, there was a tremendous amount of ethnic cleansing that they brought upon others. This is why people who were in the military or in the government, when we backed away from everything, this is why they quickly went home, because they were afraid for their family and because the history, the reputation of the Taliban, the experience was ethnic cleansing. And most in the military were from the Persian-speaking elements of Afghanistan. So this is all going to, so it's going to be interesting also to see what happens with China. Which role is China going to have? What kind of ripple is that going to have? The Russians are concerned. They may host this and host that, but they're concerned because of the potential spread of extremist, Islamist, jihadi thinking and movements and groups into Central Asia, where there's still a lot of Russians, and which is a kind of highway into Russia itself. So they're very concerned about that, because there are many people from Central Asia living in Moscow and St. Petersburg and other cities in Russia who are from that region in Central Asia, who could be potentially, dangerous terrorist elements. And then China. As I said earlier, we lost a looking post. We lost when we got out of Afghanistan. It was our best one into Western China. What's going on right now in Xinjiang province, Urumqi, in those areas with the Uyghurs? There are Uyghurs in Afghanistan who are part of the Taliban movement, one group or another. Chinese don't want them be getting into to Western China. So they got issues there. And then the other thing is, just to close off with that, Afghanistan is the premier potential conduit of natural gas from Central Asia down to India and Pakistan, both of which are natural gas poor. So Afghanistan has good natural gas resources, but Turkmenistan has the best. and that would go directly, most quickly, the easiest logistically through Afghanistan, Pakistan into India. Now, whether Pakistanis and Indians could come along and help finance that would be something to take a look at.
So Carolyn was asking about something that I was curious about too, kind of going back to your Peace Corps service a bit, that era at least. Carolyn writes, the Peace Corps mission in Afghanistan ended with the 1979 killing of the US ambassador. The pictures, I think she means that you shared, reflect the life of Afghanis approximately 40 years ago. Has the infrastructure and standard of living today changed? If so, has it been for the better or the worse?
Well, during the last 20 years, it had changed very much for the better, and particularly in terms of the numbers of Afghans who were getting educated, the numbers of Afghan females. Our Center for Afghanistan Studies trained hundreds of Afghan master teachers in Omaha, and then went back with them to Afghanistan and turned them into teacher trainers. And we trained tens of thousands of Afghan teachers. We trained hundreds of thousands of young Afghan girls getting educated. Afghans were going through medical school. They were going through university. There was a constitution that was working. Plus, there was industry starting to be successful enough that it was making a major dent into the percentages of what was the economy being generated by the drug culture or the things that were happening in the population centers. Afghans are naturally entrepreneurial. They wanted, people wanted to be able to manage their own shops. There were industries and things like that were going on. There were a lot of skyscrapers and stuff. So in many ways, the standard of living had gotten to its very best in these last 20 years, even though the country was essentially destroyed when we went back in 2002 after leading up to 9/11. So the Afghans really got into it. So did the West, not just the United States. NATO nations were very, very active. Germany, Great Britain, and others. And so it was being done. The Indians as well were very, very active. And so what? Now the Taliban has to decide what it's going to do with this. It doesn't know. So a group of Taliban have been recently interviewed. I think this was in the Washington Post, and they want to leave. They don't want to stay in Kabul. They just want to go back and do jihad because that's the only thing they know. They've never worked. In other words, they haven't even been farmers. They haven't been in shopkeepers. They haven't been shoe repair, plumbers, office workers, teachers, educated. Now they're in control.
Kind of jumping off of that, this was a question I really wanted to get to from Hila, I think, who's a student. Hila writes, as an Afghan American, I am fearful of ever returning to my country to visit my relatives. Will I ever be safe if I go back even for a visit now that the Taliban hold power and clearly are against Americans, even maybe Afghan Americans? Thoughts on that?
Well, I'd like to be able to go back too. I think it should be obvious to see. And I don't think it's safe. Right now, I have emails every day from people I know or knew of or knew about me because they were teachers that we helped train, etc., who were asking me to help them get out. I can't help them. Nobody in the United States can help them get out. But if they do get out, what we can do, what I am doing is writing letters of support so that they can go to American consulates, embassies, and join that number, getting these SIV, these special immigrant visas that we have said we're going to provide Afghans. And so they might be able to get those visas to come. Right now, people aren't going back, and I don't know when it's going to change. I just don't see the infrastructural elements that are essential to make that possible in terms of security for anybody who goes back. In other words, if you go back, you got all these various elements of Taliban moving around in different parts of the country, different parts of every town and every city, and they're not all, coordinated. And so the government spokesman may say one thing, just like the guy in Doha said something, but that wasn't going on anywhere else in the country. There's no coordinated situation. So for Akila, was it her name? Akila?
I think it's Gila. Yeah.
Okay, so anyhow, she Aquila, well, whatever. But so Hila, okay, Hila
Sorry.
Mohammed, Hila Mohammed, okay. So so in any case, I wish I could say yes, and I hope that all your family, Hila John, I hope everybody is out or can get out, and then maybe I will permit that we can get back somehow. Okay.
Thank you. One from Edward. How can I best support the Afghanistan refugees that are coming to my city?
This is an easy one to which I may respond, really is. I know that there's going to be quite a number coming to St. Louis, just as there will be to Omaha, to the Twin Cities, Des Moines. The Midwest is going to be the primary area. It's not going to be the southern area because they already have major immigrant issues and populations there. Not going to be Florida. It's not going to be New York and California. It's going to be the Midlands of the United States. And the first thing you can do is to go to Lutheran Family Services, offer money, offer furniture, offer places for people to stay. There'll be 1,000 Afghans coming to St. Louis, I'm sure. Same thing to Omaha. And there'll be people who come into Nashville who will move to Omaha later. I mean, because there are 2,000 living here now, and they're doing quite well. So that's the first thing. Also, Catholic Relief Services doing some things, and in each community, there's generally an immigrant or refugee organization or several. So go to them. It's better to go to them, concentrate the resources in the hands of those people. We're going to have the responsibility of picking up the Afghan refugees at the airports, taking them to their first place of residence, and making sure they got the process down or shopping, etc. There's a major first advantage that almost every family for sure will have a good English speaker, because many of them have been translators or they worked on, Western assistance programs and things of this nature. What they will need is housing, monies for kids' clothing, help make the schooling go right for them, attention, so that they're not anyhow.
No, that's great. And I think I'll just jump in to say, I think, Leanna, in a couple of weeks or so, we're going to have someone from the International Institute of St. Louis on as well. So hopefully we can get even some more detail there.
That's right. And I think, so I don't know where the question came from. I know we have people on the call from different locations, not just St. Louis, but what I can share, and thank you, Tom, that goes really along the lines that you just said. We have had, of course, pre-discussions with our presenters, and for the St. Louis area, what has been shared with us so far is that the NGOs are drowning in physical donations. What they're really looking for is people volunteering, as you said, Tom, taking people by the hand, showing them their way around. How do they go shopping, and how do they use public transportation or whatever. So for that personal interaction to make them feel home. But I'm sure we will hear so much more in that third coverage that is lined up with us here.
I saw a question up on the screen. What about the children and the spouses? They're not likely to be as well versed in English as the husbands, because those are the primary, translators, et cetera. Except that I do know that numbers of the families that are going to be coming to Omaha, at least we hope they will be, are families who are getting here because the wife is the one who has the English, because she was the school teacher who we trained and who was working, and so her life is in danger. Their lives are in danger because of the fact that they are female, living, and professionally in a society that doesn't regard that. Also, the other thing to remember is this: almost every Afghan had a cell phone. Almost every Afghan had a cell phone. Afghans love movies. I knew Afghans who could do the whole Titanic movie from start to finish. They would watch that. So they learned, a lot of them learn English through the media. This is not something that we, when we were in the Peace Corps, had as a resource for that. So they may be better off in that regard, yes.
Tom, Michaela asks, well, she says, I'm a social work student and I would like to work in Afghan refugee camps. Do you have any ideas on how I could get my foot in the door to do that?
Well, the Afghan refugees are all at Army bases. Then they will be moved to communities. So we didn't put Afghans in refugee camps or something elsewhere, in Afghanistan, because we're out and we couldn't do it in Pakistan or Iran or whatever. So we moved them all to American military bases. Some of them initially went to Qatar, Doha, Qatar. Some went to Germany. There are bases in Germany, Ramstein and elsewhere. And Wiesbaden and places like that, where there have been some taken as well, but they're all being processed to be able to come into the United States. So they won't be refugee camps, but they will be refugees that the refugee organizations are going to be assisting, that could use any amount of help that this individual, Michaela, has suggested that maybe she'd like to offer.
Another great question from Elliot. Elliot says, as a future counselor, are there cultural considerations that I would want to keep in mind if I work with Afghan clients or families? For instance, more collectivist family structures or patriarchal, matriarchal / egalitarian?
Well, 25 years ago, 55 years ago, it was a very much more patriarchal society. It still is to a degree. But the major thing that Afghans, they're Muslim, and they're conscious of that now because they're in a foreign country. So that's one of the things, on which they can still hang their hats. They don't eat any pork. And so, but the thing is, I have found Afghans exceedingly hospitable to hospitality, and they just welcome people's interest in them. And one thing, I think it's kind of interesting and kind of dichotomous with our own experience. We've gone through 10, 15 years of no touching. Afghan society is more of a touching society, the people hug a lot more. And men greeting each other, and women greeting each other, and shaking hands and things. So there are things like this, but the thing I've noticed is that those aren't the issues. I think if you're sincere and you're concerned and you demonstrate your interest in being helpful, just don't offer them pork. and be mindful of their, Muslim, their cultural attachment.
All right, thank you, Tom. I think we have time for just a few more questions. I want to make sure to get to Marty, who asks, could you comment on the extent to which ethnic divisions between Pashtuns and others are an important source of conflict there today? Are the Taliban mostly Pashtuns or not?
The Taliban are only Pashtun. And so there are almost no Farsi ones. Some call them Tajiks, some call them, some are Banjaris, but there are also Bazaars who are Mongols who speak Persian. And then the Turkmen and the Uzbeks all speak Persian as well. These are the people who made up the population centers, civil service for the most part. And so the Pashtuns have been more tribal, and then there's two kinds of Pashtun. There's the Durrani and the Ghilzai, and it's the Ghilzai Pashtuns who make up the predominant membership of the Taliban. They're the ones that are along the border primarily with Pakistan. And so there are a lot of Durrani Pashtuns who have been totally urbanized and who speak primarily Persian, etc., not Pashto. And so, yes, this is an issue. And this is the thing that a lot of people are scared about. Those Shia, Hazara Afghans, these are the Mongol Shia Muslims who speak Persian, they're very scared because in the past they were the victims of a lot of ethnic cleansing. Other Persian speakers too have been, and that has all been visited upon them by the Taliban elements that are the most, more likely Ghilzai and connected primarily to the refugee madrasas and training camps in Pakistan.
All right, time for probably two more. We haven't even gotten to basketball. That'll have to be another conversation sometime. But Carolyn had a great question. Why should the U.S. continue to support an attempt to promote democracy for a country who has a power structure, the Taliban, that has existed for years? We have supported them for 20 years with no real change. Can we really make a difference?
Well, we never supported the Taliban, but we did support the Afghans who were functioning. Remember, they had a constitution. I showed you the slides of a country that had a parliamentary, democratic monarchy that had elections that were sanctioned by the UN. And during the 60s and early 70s, they were also, elections. Hey, we have our Floridas with every election, right? So maybe they weren't perfect in Afghanistan, but they were functioning, and they had a constitution that they wrote that was based on that monarchy's constitution, and they were modernizing. They were getting educated. The urban areas, the population centers, it was working. That's what they want. Afghans are like Americans. They're like Germans. They're like Russians. They're like everybody else. They want to be treated with dignity. They want to have an opportunity. They want to have an education. They want health. They want a future. And they're willing to work. And they did work. So the Taliban, they've never had that experience. Maybe they're going to wake up and recognize they're going to need some of that in order to make what they're doing now happen, function. And so about basketball, let me just say this. Go to Sports Illustrated, Wizard of Kabul. I think maybe that link was sent out. Then you can find out about that. And
it's a great story. Yeah.
Thank you. I did go back to Afghanistan in the 2000s and work with some of the basketball team members of today. And some of them, some of them's parents knew of me from the days that I was in the
Mm.
Peace Corps, so that made it a lot of fun. But
That's
now,
great.
you know, that's gone.
Well, Tom, thank you. And Leanna, I think you had a quick announcement.
Yeah, I just wanted to, before we close here at 8:30, as we are scheduled for tonight, I just wanted to let everybody know all of our webinars are recorded, and you will find the recordings on our website along with the slides if we have Tom's permission to put them on there.
Of course.
So apologies, we didn't get to all the all the questions in the chat and everywhere, but I really wanted to give a big shout out to our audience here tonight for your
great.
super active Q&A. And I wanted to remind everybody again about why we are doing this here. And the basic idea of this little speaker series is really to help welcome our friends, our former partners,
Yeah.
who need our help now. So
Sure do.
thank you for all your interest, and thank you for being interested in the world.
Yep. Thank you too. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And thank you, Tom Gouttierre, for joining us, along with all of you, all of our audience, and kudos to the University of Missouri St. Louis and UMSL Global for this event. As just a quick reminder, there are several more speakers coming up as the university continues with this focus on Afghanistan. You can join us again on Monday, November 8th at 6 p.m. That one's at 6. We'll hear from Major General Corey J. Martin about the recent evacuation of civilians by the U.S. military. General Martin is responsible for directing and providing policy guidance for deployment of forces and distribution of supplies and equipment for wartime, peacetime, and humanitarian operations for the Department of Defense. So that will be another insightful presentation coming up on November 8th at 6 p.m. So good night.
Thanks to Zoom for making it happen.
Yeah, thank you all.
All right.